In every single speech communication class that I teach, the emphasis is always on the speech, at least from the students. But I try to remind them that it's not necessarily about public speaking, it's about all communication. In the interpersonal class, we can get more into the depths of relationships and how we communicate through those. But what I still find is this idea that communication is all centered around talking, not about the other aspects of communication, such as communicating nonverbally. So let's play a little communication true or false to get your brain thinking about what true communication is. True or false? When there's a communication breakdown, I can choose to not communicate with someone. This is false. Keep in mind that communication is inevitable. No matter what, even when you're not talking, you're still communicating. We can look at the picture here and still see there's a lot of going on. There's a lot of communication. Even though they're not speaking, we can look at their language through their bodies and tell, yeah, there's something that's being communicated. In this chapter, we will look at the principles of nonverbal communication. We'll explore some nonverbal communication codes and how they function in our life every single day. And then lastly, we'll talk about how to competently manage your nonverbal communication. So let's get started and let's look at those principles of nonverbal communication. One of the first principles to think about is that nonverbal communication uses multiple channels. If you remember all the way back, we talked about, well, what is communication in the first place? And we talked about the different models of communication. We mentioned that there are channels. Now, when it comes to nonverbal communication, there are different channels that one person can use to send the same exact message. For example, I'm happy can be communicated facially, by a smile. It can be communicated in your tone of voice, by just having enthusiasm. The way your eyes are squinted towards your friend, or even a hand gesture, like high-fiving your best friend, or even doing a little dance and using your entire body. All those same ideas are still really communicating the same gist. I am happy in some way. Now, the thing we have to think about with nonverbal communication is that it's always going to be more ambiguous than verbal communication. Here in the USA, we are a low context society. We like words, we like direct, tell us how it is, get to it. But nonverbal communication can't be that way. Because what I think you're nonverbally communicating to me may not be the same exact thing that you think you're communicating to me nonverbally. And because there's so much ambiguity, it can be so mysterious and confusing, the same exact acts can cause more confusion. Think about that extra long hug from a friend. Have you thought, maybe they just really need a hug today because they're sad? Or maybe this person has romantic feelings for me. What's going on here? Same action, different meanings. Keep in mind that nonverbal communication has fewer rules. When we look at verbal communication, we think about the grammar. We think about the context. We think about I before E except after C. But nonverbal communication doesn't have those same written out rules. And because of that, it adds to the ambiguity. But even though there are less rules and sometimes more ambiguity, there's going to be more meaning in our nonverbal communication. Someone saying, I'm fine, verbally means they're in a good place. They're emotionally okay. But that nonverbal action, the tone and voice, the sighing, it lets you know, no, they're not fine. People, even here in the U.S., with our low context society, we look more into the nonverbal communication. Because we feel like the nonverbal communication is something that you can't hide. It's going to be a lot truer. You can't lie with your nonverbals. So it will always carry more meaning. If we look at the graph here, we see that even though there's a verbal code, about 30-35%, nonverbal code will carry about 65 to 70% of the meaning. And this is even in a low context culture. In a high context culture, that nonverbal code can carry up to 90% of the meaning. And as you can probably start to think about already, our culture really affects how we even view nonverbal communication, how much weight we put into it, whether we're a low context or high context society. Even the different types of nonverbal cues that we give are going to be different culture to culture. Here in the US, if you're smiling really, really big, it means that you're happy. And no one's going to really question that smile unless it gets a little creepy, or if you're smiling directly at someone in a weird way. But in other cultures, especially in a lot of Asian cultures, you don't smile that big. Your smile is a little bit smaller and more contained. It would be seen as weird and frankly just abnormal to have a really big smile for no reason. Even how much eye contact you have is influenced by your culture. Some cultures, if you don't give them direct eye contact, they see it as rude. Whereas in other cultures, if you give them direct eye contact, you are being rude. So again, it's just going to matter on where you are and what culture you're existing in. Also be aware that our nonverbals are going to be influenced by our gender. Now remember, as I probably have said so many times before, I'm not just focusing in on men and women, but I'm focusing in on what we've been taught is appropriate as far as our gender and what we project out. So let's just tackle on that big elephant in the room where someone's going to say, well, women are so expressive with their nonverbal communication and men are not expressive at all. Let's go ahead and tackle that right now. In some ways, that can be true, but it depends on which emotion you're asking people to express. Remember, when we talked about emotions, women generally are more expressive when it comes to emotions like sadness and happiness and things where it's okay to be vulnerable. Whereas men are taught that they need to be strong and be manly. And in some cases, being emotionally expressive through your nonverbal communication isn't seen as manly. It's seen as weakness. So emotions like anger may be generally more readily seen in men than as opposed to being seen in women, where women are taught being angry is a very aggressive and manly characteristic, and that you shouldn't express that very much. So while there's debate going back and forth with the research, we'll see that on both sides, there can be men who are really, really good at expressing nonverbal communication and in interpreting others' nonverbal communication, and there are going to be women who are really, really good at nonverbal communication and interpreting others' nonverbal communication. So now we've covered that, yes, if we were to look at men and women differences with nonverbal communication, we'll see that women tend to show greater facial expressiveness than men. They're going to smile more. They're going to interact facially with other people, probably even have more eye contact. They've done studies, and they put two children, both little girls, in the same room, and put the chairs next to each other. And when the girls sat down to start talking, they physically moved their bodies to face each other. So you'll notice that women tend to look directly into each other's faces, and their body postures will be aimed directly towards each other. When they did this same experiment with two little boys, the little boys turned their chairs to the side and had a side-by-side conversation, giving some eye contact, but not a lot, and that their physical postures were not directly towards each other. Now that could be a territorial thing, because people have looked at the studies and that men are usually more territorial than women. And it may be just having that physical space, kind of separating themselves away from each other, may have helped with that. Now, if we look at nonverbal communication and how it interacts with technology, we realize there's been such a shift. Technology has in some ways changed the nonverbal communication game. Years, decades ago, if we're really going to take it far back enough, the only technology that we really had to understand nonverbal communication was the telephone. And phone calls were really limited to vocal cues. So how someone talked, the tone changes, that's what we can notice. But we couldn't really understand the face-to-face interaction. Nowadays, we have so much nonverbal communication that can be communicated through technology now, such as programs like Skype, where you can have a face-to-face conversation, or even looking at pictures through Instagram or Flickr. And as most of you probably know, because I'm posting this on YouTube, that YouTube also has a really big part in how we communicate non-verbally as well. And then lastly, we have to think about the fact that non-verbal and verbal combine to create communication. These two aspects don't operate singly from each other. They're not in vacuums where we can just analyze the verbal and just analyze the nonverbal. They're going to interact. Sometimes it will mean that they will work with each other, and you're really, really excited, and you're saying things that are talking about how excited you are, and I'm saying, I'm so excited, and your nonverbal also communicates that. Or there are going to be times where you contradict it, such as, yeah, I'm so excited right now. And that contradiction will say so many things without you having to say as much verbally, because you've already said it non-verbally. So keep these things in mind, that your non-verbal and your verbal will always be interacting with each other. So because this chapter has a lot of wealth in it, I'm going to break this up into multiple videos. So we've talked about the principles of communication, nonverbal communication to be exact. In the next video, we'll start off talking about those nonverbal communication codes.